ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for standing by. Welcome to the webinar today, brought to you by ComplyRight, Managing Employee Time and Pay, 7 Lies Employees Tell You, and the Truths You Need to Protect Your Rights. Please note that during the presentation, all participants will be in a listen-only mode. As a reminder, this conference is being recorded on Tuesday, September 8th, 2015. A few housekeeping items to address before we begin. Use the chat box on the left to interact with Allison and ask questions at any time, but we will hold the questions to the end for a Q&A portion of our presentation. If you're having any audio trouble, please message us in the chat box and we will do our best to assist you. You'll also receive a copy of the slides in the next few days from HR Direct, so you'll have all the information for future reference. My name is Stephanie Thomas, and I am your host on behalf of HR Direct. Thank you, everyone, for attending today's webinar, and welcome. I'm pleased to introduce you to our speaker, Alison Green, author of the popular management blog, Ask a Manager. Alison, thank you for being here today. I'll now turn it over to you, and we can get started.
Thanks so much, Stephanie, and hi, everyone. I am Alison Green, and before we launch in, I'm just going to give you a quick bit of background on me. I'm the former Chief of Staff at a national lobbying organization, and I am the creator of the Ask a Manager website, where I answer readers' questions daily on career and management issues, sort of like Dear Abby, but for the workplace. I'm also the author of 2 workplace advice books, and I write weekly columns on workplace and management issues for U.S. News & World Report, Inc. Magazine, Fast Company, and Money Magazine. And I can tell you that one category of questions that I get asked very, very frequently is about what obligations employers do and don't have and what laws govern their actions. So I'm hoping that today's webinar can take a topic that is often pretty confusing and shrouded in mystery for a lot of people and hopefully shed a little bit of light on it. So today's webinar is going to focus on 7 lies, or really pieces of misinformation that employees might tell you around the issues of time and pay. As an employer, I'm sure that most of you have heard statements like, you owe me overtime pay for last week, you can't make me work on holidays, you have to give me paid vacation, you have to give me a raise, that kind of thing. The truth is a lot of workers, and frankly a lot of managers, don't always know the difference between what employees are entitled to under company policy versus what the law requires. They're basing the sorts of statements that we just went through on what they experienced with other jobs and other workplace policies, which might not be the same at your company. Or they might even just be basing it on incorrect information that they've heard from family or friends, or just wrongly assumed to be true. So there's a lot of incorrect information floating around about labor law, and it's not at all surprising that this happens. We're going to go through 7 of these pieces of misinformation today and explain the laws behind these demands to show you the rights that you and your employees have in each scenario that we'll cover. And we'll also discuss the kind of policies that you need to protect your business while still doing right by your employees. Before we start, I want to see how informed everyone here today is about your rights in certain time and pay situations. The first one we're going to start with, we're going to do these as polls so we can see where people are coming out in these questions and talk about what the right answer is to them. This one is, are employees entitled to breaks? You have to provide rest breaks, meal breaks, or other short breaks. Are there any laws governing employers on this issue, such as the Fair Labor Standards Act? So go ahead and put in your answer here. You can just fill in the bubble and click submit. I'll give people a few seconds to vote, and we'll take a look at what the results came out as, and we'll talk about what the answer is to this. So again, the question is there a legal mandate for employers to be entitled to breaks at the federal level, at the state level, maybe in some industries and not in others? All right, here's our responses. So this is interesting because the actual answer to this is that employees are only entitled to breaks in some states. So we've got the majority of people here saying that there's a federal law requiring it, but in fact, it's really up to state law. Some states do mandate breaks. They mandate breaks of specific lengths at specific times or intervals, and other states, quite a few actually, don't require them at all. So you really want to know what your state law is on this. All right, I'm going to close this question and move on to the next one. Another area with a lot of misconception, overtime pay. If you have an employee who is entitled to overtime pay, who stays later than their scheduled hours, do they get overtime for those hours? Of course, employees who are entitled to overtime should receive pay under certain conditions, but is just working an hour or two past their scheduled time on a given day enough to qualify for overtime pay? I'll give people a couple seconds here to vote, and then we'll take a look at what the results are. Again, we're thinking about in a given day, if someone works beyond their scheduled hours and normally entitled to overtime in general, would they be entitled to it for that particular day? So it looks like the majority of people got this one right. The answer is yes, if for that entire week their hours added up to more than. And we'll talk a little bit about some of the nuances of this later in the webinar. All right, last question. You are required to pay your employees for certain non-work activities, but do you know which ones? The choices are time spent traveling between two different work sites, changing into safety gear, cleaning tools or equipment, and waiting to work. And that last one means, for example, if your computer system crashes and needs to be rebooted, and it's taking a long time to come back up, as some computer systems do you need to pay people for that time? Or is it all of the above? Go ahead and vote. We'll give people just a few more seconds for votes in. Again, a majority of people got this one right, so that is great. The answer was E, all of the above. For all of those scenarios, those are activities that people need to be paid for the time. So it looks like most of you have a really good idea of your rights with most of these workplace scenarios, which is great. We're going to go into more detail throughout the course of the webinar to explore your particular rights and the ways to still do right by your employees in these situations.
Hey, Allison?
Yes.
I wanted to pop in and just address a few people that had said they were having a little bit difficulty hearing. I didn't know if you could try to speak up a little bit louder, and we'll also be working on it on our end, but maybe both will help resolve the audio experience for everyone. So just wanted to pop in and remind you.
Absolutely. Thanks for letting me know. All right, so let's move on to, and I am going to try to speak really loudly into this. Hopefully that'll help. So let's move on to our first piece of potential misinformation that you might hear from employees, and that is, you have to give me breaks. Another common variation of this is, you have to give me meal breaks. And the truth of the matter is that in many cases you don't. So you might be surprised to learn that the Federal Fair Labor Standards Act, or the FLSA, which is how you might often hear it referred to, does not require employers to give any breaks, meals, lunch, or rest periods to employees. As we said earlier, some states do require meal or rest breaks, but unless your state or local laws require them, these breaks come down to company policy, not laws. And although federal law doesn't require you to give breaks, the law does have certain pay requirements for breaks if you do offer them. So you want to be aware of what those are. Breaks that last less than 20 minutes are considered short breaks, and they do count toward working time and must be paid. Now, if you allow a paid 10-minute break and your employee ends up taking 25 minutes instead, you don't have to pay for the unauthorized break period unless it's less than 20 minutes. So if you offer 10 minutes and your employee takes 15 instead, you'd still have to pay for that time because it's under that 20-minute limit, even though those extra 5 minutes were unauthorized. Now, you can discipline or terminate employees who regularly take longer breaks than they're given, but you do have to pay them for that time. Now, meal breaks, which are typically 30 or 60 minutes in length, are unpaid, but only if employees are completely relieved of their duties and the breaks are uninterrupted. So if any work is being done, even a minor task, or if the employee's break is interrupted or cut short, they must be paid for that time. You work in an office that has a break room, a lunchroom, a cafeteria. Encourage employees to take meal periods away from their workstations or desks. It's a lot easier for people to take their full breaks if they're not surrounded by their work. And also keep in mind, even though it's not required by federal law, giving your employees breaks is a good thing. Having downtime or mental breaks can help keep people refreshed and recharged through the day. And we're all human and we need to eat. So just make sure that your break policies are clear and consistent and that you're communicating your company's rules to your employees. And you can also look into time clock software like TrackSmart Time Clock to keep accurate records of break times so that you don't end up paying for time that wasn't spent working. So moving on to the next one, that is the claim, you have to give me time off. Now this isn't necessarily wrong, but it's not the whole truth either. Time off is a very tricky issue, so I want to test your knowledge of federal laws again by presenting you with 4 different scenarios. In each of these, pay attention to the number of employees because that's a very relevant factor. So for the first scenario, let's say that you own a business with 20 employees. One of your employees comes to you and asks to take a week off so he can seek treatment for depression. Are you required by law to grant the request for time off? Does the FMLA, Family and Medical Leave Act, or ADA, Americans with Disabilities Act, apply? Or are there no federal laws that would entitle him to time off? Now keep in mind, we're not debating paid or unpaid here, and we're not looking at state laws, just federal ones. So the poll question for you is, in this scenario, do you have to give the employee time off? Again, this is a business with 20 employees. One person is seeking a week off to get treatment for his depression. The question is, are you required by law, either the Family and Medical Leave Act, or the Americans with Disabilities Act, or potentially another federal law, to give that employee time off? Again, it's not a question of whether the time off would be paid or unpaid. It's not a question of state law, just federal. All right, so we have got our results in here, and interestingly, only about a quarter of the people, or no, actually about a fifth of the people got the answer to this one right, which is that the ADA does apply here. ADA, I suspect people might have answered the way they did because they were thinking the ADA kicks in at 50 employees, but it actually kicks in at 15. So that might be where people went wrong with this one. All right, moving on to our next scenario. I'm going to keep this results slide up here while I describe the next scenario, and then we'll move to the poll. So let's say you run a company with 100 employees. On Friday morning, an employee calls to tell you that she has a sore throat and she won't be able to come in. You remind her that she's in the middle of a big project and she needs to come in to finish up. She tells you she's sick and you have to give her time off. But do you have to? Again, we're considering federal law, not state or local law. Under federal law, is an employee in this situation legally entitled to take the time off? So again, we're looking at, might this be something that the Family and Medical Leave Act would cover, maybe the Americans with Disabilities Act, or is it a situation where no federal laws would require you to give the time? You might choose to, regardless, but what does the law say? So I'll give a few more seconds for people to go ahead and get their votes in, and we'll take a look at the correct answer for this scenario. Great. So in this case, a majority of respondents got the right answer, which is that in this case, no federal laws apply. And that's because a sore throat isn't something that's covered under FMLA or ADA. All right, let's go to one more. Actually, I think we're going to do two more. Let's go to our third. So you own a business that operates 6 days a week, Monday through Saturday. You've got 15 employees who work on a rotating schedule so that no one gets stuck working every single weekend. But you still have one employee scheduled for at least one Saturday a month. Then, seemingly out of the blue, one of your employees asks you to stop scheduling him on Saturdays because he's Jewish and he observes the Sabbath. You have to comply with this request. So again, you've got 15 employees. and you have one employee who's asking to be excused from working on Saturdays because he's Jewish and observes the Sabbath on that day, is that a request that the law requires you to comply with? So we'll give you a few more seconds for people to get their answers in. Great, so here we've got our results. Interesting, we have a perfect 50-50 split on this one. So the answer for this one is yes, you do need to give the employee time off, and that is because of the law that requires you to make reasonable accommodations for employees' sincerely held religious beliefs. And we'll get to, later in the webinar, we'll talk a little bit about exactly what that law is and what it means for you. All right, let's do one more. So let's fast forward to November 8, 2016, next year, the day of the United States presidential election. Let's say that around lunchtime, an employee asks you if she can leave early to vote and avoid the long lines at the polls. You deny the request, and she says that you have to give her the time off to vote. She says voting is a right in the U.S., and you're infringing upon her rights by denying her the time off. Under federal law, is she correct? Are you required by law, by federal law, to give employees time off to vote? Give people a few more seconds to get answers in, and then we'll take a look at the results for this one, which is our final poll question. Again, the question is whether she's correct under federal law. So interesting, again, we have nearly a perfect 50-50 split on this one. So the answer to this is that no, she's not correct. No federal laws apply. There's no federal law that requires you to give employees time off to vote. Doesn't mean you shouldn't choose to do it anyway, but the law doesn't require you to do it. Okay. So it seems like on a lot of these, people were really split on their answers. There were some where people were pretty confident about the right answers, and others where they were less so. Let's move forward. Very strange with our slides here, but you guys can nicely pretend to ignore that. Let's go back, I think, and take a look, a deeper dive into some of these poll questions. So in the question about where you do and don't have to give time off for sickness or for religious accommodation, so generally speaking, the only time that you might be required under federal law to give time off is for medical, religious, or military-related needs. Two federal laws govern medical leave, the FMLA and the ADA. The FMLA is a very complex law, and it doesn't apply to every business. The federal law only applies to businesses with 50 or more employees. That includes part-timers, temporary employees, and employees who are on leave, on the payroll in 20 or more work weeks in the current or preceding calendar year. And even if the FMLA does apply to your business, it may not apply to every employee. So to qualify for FMLA leave, employees have to have worked for at least 12 months and a minimum of 1,250 hours, and they must work at a location where at least 50 of your employees are employed within 75 miles. So like I said, it's complicated. Keep in mind, too, that only, quote, serious health conditions are covered under the FMLA. And that can include an employee giving birth to, adopting, or caring for a new child, caring for their own serious health condition, or assisting an immediate family member with a serious health condition. The FMLA does not grant leave for employees who have minor illnesses, like the employee in our scenario who had the cold and was calling in sick with a sore throat or a cold. Even if she qualified for FMLA, she wouldn't be able to use that FMLA leave to stay home with a common cold. She'd only be able to use it for the condition that she had received that FMLA leave for. The FMLA also applies to certain military-related leave, such as attending specific military events, going to counseling sessions, or caring for a covered service member. And even if your business is not covered by the FMLA, for instance, if you have fewer than 50 employees, you might be required to give employees time off under the ADA, the Americans with Disabilities Act. The ADA applies to businesses with 15 or more employees, and it allows workers who have physical or mental disabilities to request reasonable accommodations of their employers, which might include time off. The definition of a disability is very broad. Under the ADA, a person with a disability is someone who has a physical or mental impairment that substantially limits one or more major life activities, such as walking, breathing, seeing, hearing, speaking, learning, or working. So by that definition, as you can tell, a lot of major illnesses, including cancer, heart disease, psychiatric impairments like employee number one's depression, diabetes, even substance abuse, can be seen as disabilities, thus allowing employees to request time off as a reasonable accommodation. If you're giving your employee time off as an accommodation, if it would cause what the law calls undue hardship, then you can deny the request. But you'd need to be prepared to back up that claim of undue hardship with documentation. And this is an area where you'd really want to consult with an employment lawyer, because what the courts consider undue hardship might be very different from what you consider undue hardship. Finally, the employee in our scenario who didn't want to work on Saturdays so that he could observe the Sabbath is protected under Title VII of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. Title VII applies to employers with at least 15 employees, and it prohibits discrimination in employment based on race, color, religion, sex, and national origin. Discrimination can include denying a request for reasonable accommodation, like a scheduling change, of an employee's sincerely held religious beliefs or practices, unless such an accommodation would cause the business undue hardship. So that is a lot of information to digest, I realize, but in summary, if an employee is asking for time off for medical, religious, or military-related reasons, you want to think twice before denying it. Okay, so when don't you have to give time off? For pretty much any other scenario. The federal FLSA, again that's the Fair Labor Standards Act, does not require employers to give their employees time off for holidays, vacations, sick leave, or other reasons like annual events, birthdays, volunteering, voting, jury duty, bereavement leave, child care, or other family obligations, either with or without pay. Of course, the key word in all of the previous points is federal. Let's talk a little bit about state and local laws. Things get more complicated at the state and the local level, where laws tend to, but don't always, afford employees more rights and more time off. A lot of states have their own versions of the FMLA and the ADA, which may cover smaller employers or might include more employee-friendly provisions, such as longer leave, leave for additional circumstances, or even paid leave. For instance, in our earlier scenario, the woman who wanted to vote in the 2016 election, she might be entitled to time off depending on where she is. If your business is in Florida, you wouldn't have to give her any time off to vote. But if you're located in California, she would be entitled to up to 2 hours with pay at the beginning or the end of her shift. In addition to voting, certain local laws can also allow employees time off to attend a child's school-related activity, recover from a workplace injury, serve as a witness or a juror in a judicial proceeding, donate blood, undergo breast cancer screenings, or volunteer in certain disaster recoveries. So you really want to know what your state law is. The employee in our scenario who had a sore throat might be entitled to time off if your business is located in one of the states or the cities where paid sick leave laws have been passed. And that's something to keep an eye on too. There's been a huge push for paid sick leave laws in a lot of different areas nationwide. Even just yesterday, the new federal regulation that was announced requiring paid sick leave for federal contractors is a new development. So you want to make sure that you really keep an eye on this area, that you're aware of any initiatives in your city or your state, and that you really keep abreast of any changes to your local laws. Now that we've gone over what your rights are when it comes to time off, I want to take a moment to argue the case for giving your employees time off. Time off, and especially paid time off, is a very attractive employee benefit. If you don't offer time off, you may be losing out on stellar employees who will very likely seek out employers who do offer that benefit. So we're talking here only about what the law does and doesn't require. But what you should do and what best practice is a very different question. The fact of the matter is it's not realistic to expect employees to work day in, day out indefinitely without needing time off for personal issues. Everyone gets sick, everyone experiences loss, and everyone needs rest and relaxation. It's been proven several times over that vacations often work as a reset button and make people more productive in the long run. But you want to keep in mind what we're talking about here today is what the law requires. It's not necessarily the limits of what you should be doing. And administering and handling time off is highly manageable if you take the time to create and communicate a clear, consistent policy, as well as use electronic tools to track day-to-day attendance. All right, let's talk about the next thing that you might hear from employees that isn't quite correct, and that is, you can't make me work on holidays. Related to what we've been talking about, but slightly different. Again, as an employer, you aren't required to give specific time off for holidays unless the employee requests it to celebrate a religious holiday or cultural event. Then Title VII comes into play for employers with 15 or more employees, and unless it would cause undue hardship for your business, requires that you accommodate bona fide requests for religious accommodation. A lot of employers close their doors for certain holidays, although they're not required to do it. Most common holidays that employers recognize in the U.S. are New Year's Day, Memorial Day, 4th of July, Labor Day, Thanksgiving, and Christmas. And some employers also close for Martin Luther King Jr. Day as well. All right, I skipped 3. President's Day, Veterans Day, and Columbus Day are on that list too. But again, closing is not required on those days. It's up to you as an employer. If you do stay open on holidays, you're not required to provide premium pay for employees who work unless those hours are counted as overtime. A lot of employers do offer premium pay for some of these dates as an employee benefit or as a way to incentivize employees to come in for their scheduled hours on the holidays. But there aren't any laws that require you to pay time and a half or double or anything like that for employees who do work those days. The same rules apply on weekends too. You're not required to give employees weekend days off, nor do you have to provide premium pay or holiday pay if they work on those days. All right, next piece of information that you might hear is you have to give me a raise. This is another employee myth, the idea that you have to give raises. Let me cut right to the chase on this one. As long as you are paying the minimum wage, no law requires you to give your employees raises. So right now, the federal minimum wage is set at $7.25 for all employees and $10.10 for federal contractors. If your city or your state has a higher minimum wage, you have to pay that amount instead. Raising the minimum wage is hands down the #1 employment law trend for this year. And as I'm sure you've seen, the issue has expanded beyond the labor law news bubble. It's gotten a lot of coverage in mainstream national media. There have been protests, statements from President Obama and his administration, and a lot of time and attention in general to the issue of raising the minimum wage. Just this year, New York State, Los Angeles, and Seattle have all increased their minimum wage to $15, more than double the federal minimum wage. So it's definitely something to keep a very close eye on in the coming months. Now, let me add, while you're not required to give raises, you probably should. Even if an employee's performance is just standard, you want to keep in mind that inflation and the cost of living go up every year. So wages this year aren't worth as much in real dollars as next year. You want to take the time to recognize and motivate employees in other ways, of course, but increasing employee pay is a really good way to reward employees for a job well done and to be able to retain your best people. Let's talk about the next piece of misinformation that you might hear. You have to put me on salary. A lot of employees who are paid hourly tend to think that being put on salary is also a reward, but it's not that simple. I'd like to get this out of the way first. You don't have to make employees salaried if you don't want to. That being said, putting employees on a salary can actually end up being easier and cheaper for you, depending on the nature of the job. Salaried and hourly only refer to how employees are paid. A salaried employee is one who earns a set amount per pay period, often regardless of how much time they spent working. An hourly employee is one who earns a fixed amount per hour worked. For jobs with fluctuating demand, say 40 hours this week but only 20 hours next week, it might be smarter to continue paying those employees on an hourly basis. But for jobs with a steady demand, especially jobs where employees are often working more than 40 hours a week, salaried pay might work out in your favor. Under the Fair Labor Standards Act, employees are classified as either exempt or non-exempt. So just a quick refresher on this, non-exempt employees must receive at least the minimum wage for all the hours that they worked. And they must receive overtime pay, which is 1.5 times the regular hourly rate, for any hours over 40 that they work in a week. Exempt employees, on the other hand, are almost always paid a salary and are not entitled to overtime pay. Putting employees on salary can help your case for exemption, but it's not enough to prove that they are exempt. The FLSA has very specific guidelines for that, so let's talk a bit about what that takes. So the first guideline is called the salary basis test, where exempt employees must be paid a set amount each week, regardless of the quantity or quality of work. The minimum weekly salary for exemption right now is $455, which comes out to $23,660 annually. But this might be changing soon. So hold that thought for now. I want to focus on exemption tests at the moment, but I promise I'll revisit the proposed FLSA regulations in a few minutes. The other guideline for exemption is what's known as the primary duties test. It means that the employee's primary duties must fall under one of the highly specialized exemptions under the FLSA. The most common exemptions are the executive, administrative, and professional exemptions. They're often referred to as the white-collar exemptions. Executive employees must manage at least 2 people and have hiring and firing authority. Administrative employees must do office work that's related to the management or policies of the business, and they must be able to make independent decisions on important matters. Professional employees must have responsibilities that require advanced work in the fields of science and learning. There's other exemptions for outside sales employees and certain computer and creative professionals as well. Let's say you've got a team manager who's paid on an hourly basis. She makes $20 an hour. She works at least 40 hours a week, which puts her pay at around $800 per week and annually around $41,600. If she works 50 hours for half of those weeks, you would be obligated to pay her an additional $7,800 per year in overtime, bringing her annual pay to nearly $50,000. If she were salaried at the $41,600, you wouldn't have to pay the overtime, and her total pay would stay at the $41,600, while you still get the benefit of her working the extra hours. So in this case, classifying her as exempt would work in your favor. So before you deny any requests from employees who want to be salaried, sit down, examine the nature of the job, because it might end up actually being better for you. So now that you know who's entitled to overtime pay, let's go over when overtime pay is actually owed to employees. You may have heard people say before, you've got to pay me overtime when you work late. So let's talk about how that works. Let's say you've got a non-exempt employee who's scheduled from 10 a.m. to 4 p.m. on Monday through Friday, so 6 hours a day. But it's your busy season, and he ended up staying until 5 on all 5 days. So now he's coming to you and saying you owe him overtime for working late on those 5 days. After all, he worked over his scheduled time, so he's entitled to overtime pay, right? In reality, that's not how overtime works. The FLSA sets the bar for overtime at 40 hours per work week. According to the Department of Labor, a work week is, I'm going to quote here, a fixed and regularly recurring period of 168 hours, 7 consecutive 24-hour periods. It need not coincide with the calendar week, but may begin on any day and at any hour of the day. Different work weeks may be established for different employees or groups of employees. So what that means is the work week can be any 7 consecutive 24-hour periods, which grants you a lot of flexibility to keep overtime expenses under control. Say you set your work week with Wednesday morning as the first day, even if your business is only Monday through Friday. If you schedule an employee to work 10-hour days Monday through Friday for a total of 50 hours for the calendar week, only 30 hours for the work week, which would only consist of Wednesday, Thursday, Friday here. If you schedule them for a total of 10 more hours on Monday and Tuesday, you wouldn't need overtime, or you wouldn't owe overtime. So depending on your business's needs and workers, changing your work week may end up making sense for you. As an employer, you can play around with different work weeks for different employees to see which work week makes the most sense. And as with everything we're covering today, the answer might be different in your state. So again, you want to really be aware of state laws. For example, California has a daily overtime law, which means that in California, non-exempt employees are entitled to overtime for every hour more than 8 that they work in a single day. So make sure you know your local laws before changing up your work week or denying anyone overtime pay. I want to take a moment here and revisit the topic of classifying employees as exempt and non-exempt here. Again, exempt employees are not entitled to overtime. If you're not following the Department of Labor's exemption criteria and you're misclassifying employees as exempt when they aren't actually, you could be illegally denying your workers the wages they've earned and are legally entitled to, which is a lawsuit or investigation waiting to happen. The Department of Labor takes this really seriously and pursues these matters aggressively. And since 2009, they've collected $1.3 billion in back wages for more than 1.5 million workers nationwide. One of the biggest cases involved an investigation into Walmart's pay practices in 2012. Walmart had to pay $4.83 million in back wages and damages to employees it had illegally denied overtime. More than 4,000 workers received money from the settlement. So if this can happen to a giant company like Walmart, it can absolutely happen to smaller companies as well. When you're classifying employees, you want to look beyond job titles and examine their primary duties. You might think that a manager is always going to be exempt, but if the role doesn't include hiring and firing authority, the role does not qualify for the executive exemption. So take the time to get it right, and you'll save money in the long run. Now that being said, the Department of Labor has proposed some changes to the exemption regulations, which if adopted will really shake things up. So as it stands right now, the salary requirement for exemption is $455 a week or $23,660 a year. The proposed changes would more than double that salary requirement and ensure that it increases year over year by indexing it to the 40th percentile of weekly earnings for full-time salaried employees determined by the Bureau of Labor Statistics. So it's estimated that the minimum requirement for 2016 would be, under this proposed new rule, $970 per week, which comes out to annually $50,440,000. I don't know why I keep adding an extra thousand. It would come out annually to $50,440. So before you give your employees raises to meet this requirement, keep in mind that the number will change yearly. An employee who's making $970 per week in 2016 would be exempt from overtime, but that same employee would be entitled to overtime the following year if he or she stayed at that $970 per week level. And if adopted, these changes could affect nearly 11 million workers and potentially cost businesses millions of dollars in overtime. So it's absolutely critical that you keep an eye on the issue and see how it pans out over the next few months. Finally, we've come to our last employee myth. You have to pay me for that. So you've probably found in your own experience some employees believe they're owed money for every minute that they spend at the office, regardless of whether or not they are working. They might be asked to be paid for showing up early, for commuting, for office parties. That list can go on and on. like most of the misinformation that we've talked about today, there's some truth here. There are certain work-related activities that employers must pay for under the FLSA. So let's consider a few of them. Changing into uniforms or other clothing that's necessary for the job should be paid for if it's integral and indispensable to the work. Commuting usually is not considered paid time unless you require the person to stop on the way to pick up supplies or pick up other employees. In that case, the second leg of that trip is working time. Travel during the day between work sites, like going from one store or one job site to another, is considered working time and should be paid for. If employees travel for business purposes during their regularly scheduled work hours, that travel time is payable. You also need to pay people for all work time, such as showing time that they spend setting up a booth and preparing for a trade show, no matter what time of day or time of the week it takes place. Time spent in training and meetings is considered working time if the attendance is required or if the event is directly related to the employee's job. If your computer system crashes and people are waiting around for it to reboot, that waiting time is working time under the FLSA. And last, certain pre- and post-work activities are also paid if they're necessary to the job. So cleaning or repairing equipment that's used in the job, changing into and out of required clothes at the workplace, washing and showering should all be counted as hours worked if any of those activities are necessary to the job. The widespread use of technology and electronic tools comes into play here. Can you expect non-exempt employees to respond to voicemails, emails, or texts before or after their scheduled shifts? Not without paying them for their time, according to the FLSA. Keeping track of the time that people spend on those activities is tough, so as a best practice, it's best to avoid contacting non-exempt employees outside of work hours. On the other side of the coin are employees who might try to use that to their advantage. So for example, if they have email access from home, they might check it, or they might take other work home and then ask to be compensated for it. And you would have to pay them, even if the time was unauthorized. Now, you can ban overtime at your company. You can even discipline people for working unauthorized overtime. But if they do work that overtime, even without permission, you still have to pay them for that time. If you have a problem with employees abusing overtime, it's important to put your foot down and make it stop. But meanwhile, you do still owe them for the work they did. So to wrap everything up, let's review the key points that we've covered today. While some employees will knowingly lie to you, a lot of workers, really a lot of managers, just don't fully understand the law around time off and pay, and they might have a misunderstanding of what the law requires. Most time and pay basics like breaks, time off, holidays, raises are actually tied to company policy, not laws. If laws do apply, they're typically only at the state or the local level, so people might be familiar with more employee-friendly laws than those in your area, and that can lead to misunderstandings. Right now, employers need to watch out for 3 big labor law changes: paid sick leave, minimum wage increases, and the proposed changes to the FLSA's exemption regulations, which affect overtime. All of these laws could potentially impact your business and what your employees are owed, so keep a really close eye on them. Communicating company policies and laws to employees is critical. Employee handbooks are a great way to share that information, as are labor law postings like the minimum wage poster. And you can also take advantage of attendance tracking software, which will show employees when they've actually earned overtime or how much time they have to take off. And then finally, I want to stress again that this webinar covers what your rights are, but you should offer people more than the bare minimum to maintain your status as an attractive competitor employer. I mean, would you want to work at a company that did not give you breaks, only paid the minimum wage, and expected you to work 365 days a year? Probably not. So most of the lies or misinformation that we've discussed today, they're not covered by law, but compromising between the legal bare minimum And the typical employee demands will make people more productive, more engaged, and more loyal to your company.
Thank you, Alison.
All right. Thanks,
awesome.
Stephanie. Let's go ahead and open it up for questions.
Okay, yes, we are open for Q&A portion for the rest of the presentation. We've got about 10 minutes, and we have a lot of questions rolling in now. The first question I have for you, Alison, is from Erica. If the ADA applies to your business and an employee asks for time off as a reasonable accommodation, do you have to give it to them if it wouldn't cause undue hardship, even if another accommodation would work better for the employer?
Great question. So just because time off can be a reasonable accommodation does not mean that it is the only accommodation that you can give that person. So employees are entitled to reasonable accommodations, but the accommodations don't always have to be the ones that are their first choice. So if you have, let's say you've got a receptionist who needs to stand at the front desk and she breaks her hip, she might ask for time off work until she's fully healed and can stand. The time off could be considered a reasonable accommodation, but you could also just reconsider the requirement that she stand all day. You could allow her to sit or provide her with a chair, and if that allows her to return to work, that could be considered a reasonable accommodation. So the idea is that you want to have an interactive dialogue with the person, figure out what the options are, and figure out which potential accommodation that would work for the person makes the most sense for the business.
Okay, all right. Well, just scrolling through here, we'll try to get a few questions answered. There was one specifically, Alison, that I thought would be good for you from Denise. So we had talked about hiring and firing for exempt and kind of the classification. What about hiring and firing volunteers and being in charge of volunteers? What would be the status on that?
Ooh, that is a great question, and I don't know for sure. So my hunch is no, that volunteer coordination can often be done by fairly junior level employees, and I am like 99.9% sure that for the exemption to be in effect, you need to be able to hire and fire employees. But if your business makes heavy use of volunteers, it would be worth checking with an attorney. If you're not going to check with an attorney, default to assuming that it does not qualify the person.
Got it. Another question about employees from Stephanie. How about on-call employees who carry a company cell phone and need to be available? How do you classify and calculate time for that employee?
Yeah, so that's super tricky, and it will also depend heavily on your state laws. So some states have very precise laws that will cover how you should calculate working time for those people. But in general, the law is that if they are free to go about their day, they can take a nap, they can hang out at home, they can go shopping, and they just have to have the phone on them and answer it. The working time that you have to pay them for is only the actual time spent on the phone dealing with calls and any follow-up. It does not mean that if you assign me to be on call all day today, but I don't actually take any calls, you don't need to pay me for that time, as long as I'm free to go about my day. Now, if you require me to sit in an office waiting for that phone to ring, then you've restricted what I can't really go about my day, and that full day in that case would need to be paid.
Okay, well, I hope that was helpful for you, Stephanie. Julie has a question about holidays. We have people who are required to work on Christmas. Are we in violation of federal law?
You would only be in violation of federal law if they had a bona fide religious objection to working on Christmas and you refused to consider reasonable accommodation for them. So if people don't have a religious objection to working, you can absolutely require it. If they do have a religious objection to working and you can't seem to figure out a way to staff the business otherwise, then you're getting into the question of would accommodating them be an undue hardship?
Okay, so go back to that employee and see if they're willing or have an objection to working. Okay, so another question we have about FMLA, going back to FMLA time, what about an employee that is undergoing a weight loss program and under a doctor's care? Would that be covered?
Interesting. I think it's not. The FMLA is pretty specific about this needing to be a serious condition. I can envision situations where maybe that could qualify if the person was dangerously overweight and it really was part of a serious medical treatment. In general, I would think no. But you'd want to take a look at the law and maybe talk to your lawyer to be sure that that particular person's circumstance.
Okay, sounds good. And actually, we want to go back to that religious accommodation type question. We got a really good question from Nicole. Can you require documentation from an employee that indicates they need religious accommodation? That might be tricky. How would you go about that?
That is very tricky. So if you have doubts as to, well, first of all, I would say the law and court cases on this strongly encourage you to assume that the employee's religious beliefs are sincere, unless you have some specific reason to doubt it. So in general, you want to default to believing people. If there's something particularly strange about your situation where you have particular reason to question it, at that point, I would talk to a lawyer. And the reason, it's not a cop-out on my part, maybe it is a little bit, but the reason I'm saying talk to a lawyer at that point is you don't want to inadvertently do something that could be construed as religious harassment. So at that point, you'd want a lawyer really looking at the specifics of your situation and guiding you on what makes sense to do. But in general, the law strongly encourages you to assume that people's religious beliefs are bona fide unless there is reason to think otherwise.
That's very good advice. Thank you, Allison. Kind of going deeper into the documentation process, we did get a question from Lisa that would be relevant about the sick law. You can't deny people time for the sick law, but she's asking to clarify that. But can you even ask why they're taking time off under these new laws that are being released?
So this is really interesting. I was actually just writing something on this, so I'm extra familiar with this. So here's what's interesting. The Americans with Disabilities Act, which remember only applies to conditions that substantially limit life activity, so it doesn't apply to a cold or a flu. The Americans with Disabilities Act does not allow you to inquire into the details of an employee's medical condition unless it's essential to being able to conduct your business or figure out an accommodation. So what that means is if the reason the person is calling in sick is because of a condition that's covered under the ADA, you shouldn't be asking questions about it. Now, the bind that puts you in as an employer is that you have no idea before you ask that question if the answer is going to be something covered under the ADA. It might be something not covered under the ADA, like a sprained ankle or the flu. So you don't really know before you're asking that question what kind of answer you're getting and whether it's going to take you into a sticky ADA situation or not. So in general, it's good practice to just ask people when they think they're going to be able to get back at work. If you need them to do something that day, are they able to make an exception to their time off and do it for you? It's good to not go mucking around in the details because you don't know when you might trigger that ADA thing. I will say also relatedly, some employers like to require doctor's notes when people are going to be out for more than a certain number of days, and you want to make sure if you're doing that, you do not want those doctor's notes to give you details about people's medical conditions. You just want to know that they've been seen by a doctor and the doctor agrees that they need time off work. Okay, so the details can be omitted from those doctor's notes. That's good to know. Thank you. We have one question from Rachel, and then we'll probably take one more. We have salaried exempt salesmen that go on FMLA, but they may still make sales calls from home. Do we still have to pay their salary? One of the primary duties of the job is for them to actually go out and meet with customers. Ooh, they should not be doing any work while they're on FMLA leave. So I would say take a closer look at that and compare it to what the law allows, because there might be an exception if it's intermittent FMLA and it's someone who frequently works from home anyway. But in general, generally speaking, you're not supposed to let people who are on FMLA do any work, and if it looks like you're encouraging them to, it can trigger something in the law that's called FMLA interference. So you want to be really careful with that one. So I would take a closer look before you even get to the question of whether you should be paying them for the time. Okay, I think the common thread here is to proceed with caution on all accounts, which is very paramount for an employer, of course.
We have one final question to ask, and I apologize if I mispronounced the name. Agnieszka Hartman, do we have to pay overtime if employee will have to stay longer to fix his or her mistakes that already cost the company labor, wages, and material and time? How do you handle that?
You do have to pay it, and I know that can be frustrating as an employer because you feel like you wouldn't even need to have them there for the time if they had higher work quality to begin with, but you do. It's considered just a standard cost of doing business that people will make mistakes. Now, you have some options. If it's a very serious mistake or if it's a pattern of mistakes, you can certainly discipline that person up to the point of even removing them from the job. But for the work that they're doing for your benefit, you do have to pay them for that time.
All right, well that does wrap up our Q&A portion for today and the webinar. Thank you, Allison, for speaking and going deep into the details for the misinformation that employees may tell you and the truths you need to protect your rights. It was much appreciated.
Well, thank you so much for having me. I really enjoyed talking with everyone today, and I hope people found this helpful.
Great. And everyone, I know there's been a few questions that I do want to address really quickly. Yes, you will receive a follow-up email by the end of the week from HR Direct with the copy of the slides to take notes, to go back to any questions you had, and a recording of the presentation. And also, if you had any really pressing questions that you wanted answered, you can email me. You can either reply back to the meeting reminder email that you get, or email me at sjthomas@hrdirect.com, and we'll get an answer to you in the next couple days to make sure that you can get started on what you need to do. I do want to remind you, next month we are continuing with our webinar series, and again, we're on the new day, Tuesday, October 13th. It's Welcome to the Cloud, what businesses need to know about online tax filing. So as we can prepare for end-of-year tax reporting, we're already going into October next month. E-filing is continuing to grow in popularity, and we'll be here to answer any questions you may have about online tax filing and making sure you can prepare 1099s, W-2s, and other employee information forms in the cloud safely and securely. So we'll be here answering the pressing questions you have about how to handle online tax filing as the year comes to an end. Thank you again all for attending. Please, again, sjthomas@hrdirect.com if you have any questions, and we'll see you next month. Thank you, everyone, and have a great day.